So first we have our first speaker is Brandon Barfield. He is the director and co-founder of SLP DWOQ and is a nationally known as student loan expert for graduate health professions. Since 2011, Brandon has given over 500 loan repayment presentations for schools, hospitals, and medical conferences across the country, and is regularly requested to present at some of the nation's most prestigious institutions. He also serves as a consultant for employers looking to incorporate loan repayment into their recruitment strategies and compensation packages. Now we will watch a pre-recorded video from Brandon on student loan updates for anesthesia residents.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Barfield. I am the director and co-founder of Doctors Without Quarters. And today we're talking all about student loans and loan repayment strategies specifically for anesthesia residents. I'm assuming you're all pursuing anesthesia since we are here for part of the AOCA event this weekend. Now, first of all, I apologize. I could not be presenting live for you this morning. I already had a conflict on the calendar, but I really appreciate the administration allowing me to make this recording so we could still offer you some valuable content this morning. Now, before we get into today's presentation, I want to take just a quick moment to introduce to you Student Loan Professor. Many of you are probably already familiar with Doctors Without Quarters. We founded that company in 2015 as a student loan resource, primarily for the physician community. And over the years, we've counseled nearly 10,000 or actually over 10,000 individual borrowers, with most of those being early career physicians. But we did something kind of crazy recently. We actually rebranded the company to Student Loan Professor, mainly because a lot of the schools and the hospitals we work with, they expressed to us that they needed something a little more general or broad-based or welcoming for their non-physician programs, nurses, so on and so forth. We are still very much dedicated and focused on the physician community. You are 90% of our business and will remain that way. And so please don't, let the name confuse you at all. We're still Doctors Without Quarters at our core. All right. So let's go and get into the presentation today. We've got a very abbreviated agenda. I was asked to keep this at about 15 to 20 minutes. In fact, I'm not even going to show you a formal agenda, but I want to focus on the student loan changes and impacts and programs that I think are going to be most relevant to you. Again, based off your specialty, that hopefully you'll find interesting and relevant, especially with repayment getting ready to begin here in the very next month. So let's start out just by talking about some updates legislatively. No doubt you heard the Supreme Court did shoot down the president's loan cancellation, the $10,000 to $20,000 thing he was trying to do. While that is done, the president did come out literally within, I think, an hour and a half of that press conference and said that they are already working on another mass loan cancellation opportunity, and they're going to try to, make it where it's going to get better procedural, make it through more legal scrutiny, so on and so forth. We'll see how that goes. They just started what's called negotiated rulemaking in late August, and they've got to kind of go through that process. So I suspect we'll see some sort of details emerge from this maybe around November or by the end of the year. But right now, we really don't have any details to share with you on what that next loan forgiveness policy might look like. What I can tell you is it is a pretty high priority for this particular administration. So there is something else coming. And then also, the one-time account adjustment, let me go ahead and tell you that no, this particular program does not impact most medical residents. But the reason I'm sharing it with you today is it's getting a lot of hype in the news right now. Number one, the program is expiring at the end of this year. So there's a big push right now for people to consolidate their own loans and whatnot to take advantage of this. And also, there's a lot of news articles talking about how many millions of dollars are getting forgiven under this program. The IDR one-time account adjustment, put plainly, is a look-back provision allowing people that have older types of debts that aren't supposed to qualify for forgiveness if they were not on an income-driven repayment plan. It's basically giving those borrowers credit towards either PSLF or income-driven repayment forgiveness, and in some cases actually putting them past the threshold where they qualify for forgiveness. And that's why you're seeing these forgiveness headlines take place. Now, if you're a resident and you've graduated in the last few years, you've already got direct loans. Your loans already qualify for all the latest programs. Either you've been in the CARES Act or you were probably in an income-driven payment plan before the CARES Act. And so we don't really see most residents and even fellows impacted by this. It's mainly for, I'll say, older borrowers, if you don't mind me using that oversimplification there. But I just want to kind of get ahead of that because you are seeing it in the news right now. All right. Now, let's also talk about what's going on with income-driven or payment plans. So if you're not familiar with IDR plans, they look at your income as opposed to your debt level to determine how much you have to pay on your loan from 1 month to the next. That is particularly beneficial for residents who find yourselves in a very high debt to income period of your career, right? Now, that's going to change when you get into practice and you're making the good money there. But residents can really benefit from these programs. They offer interest subsidies. They offer long-term taxable loan forgiveness. We don't see a lot of residents pursuing that particular piece of it, but mainly they give you budget relief during your residency years. So you're not spending half your paycheck trying to make like a standard 10-year payment plan or something of that nature. So what they do is they look at your previous year's AGI, your adjusted gross income, so your previous year's tax return, and from that they subtract a pretty decent chunk of the federal poverty level, around $22,000 or so, maybe even more if you've got a family size greater than one. But as you can see here, at the start of this summer, this is what the family of different income-driven payment plans look like, and most borrowers were down here, especially residents. Either they were on pay or repay, with the biggest differences between those being that pay as you earn lets you do a married filing separate tax return strategy in case your spouse has an income. You don't want them driving up your joint income and therefore your payment. And so a lot of doctor couples do like to do a married filing separate tax return for the benefit of keeping their loan payment low and their forgiveness opportunity high. And also when you get into practice, the fact that there's a cap on this. They won't force you to pay more than the standard 10-year payment equivalent. While repay does not have a cap and doesn't let you do the married filing separate provision, it has one huge benefit, and that's a 50% interest subsidy. So when you're in training and your payment doesn't cover all your interest, they kick in and they wipe out some of that interest, so you don't have such like this ballooning effect going on your student debt. So there is some interest accumulating during your training years, but they are literally cutting that in half. Now, here's what happened this summer. As part of what the media has dubbed Biden's Plan B, they took something called the new SAVE plan. They were originally calling it revised repay. Well, repay stands for revised pay as you earn. So they were kind of building on that. But the repay/save, they went ahead and decided to fast forward some of the best features of this program effective August 1st. Higher poverty level, 225%. That's about $33,000 that gets deducted from your income before they calculate your payment. Still a 10% payment and a 100% interest subsidy. That is a huge deal for residents. You will not accumulate a dime in interest above what your monthly payment is under this new SAVE plan. That's going to save residents a ton of money. And also, right here, they will let you do the married filing separate tax return moving forward. So that's an exciting change as well. A lot of residents will want to take advantage of the new temporary SAVE program. And then as of July of next year, they're putting the final provisions of SAVE in place. Most notably, if you've got any undergrad debt, they'll give you a weighted average payment between 5 and 10%, depending on how many of your loans might be from undergrad. And you will notice there's no pay-as-you-earn plan here. They are phasing out the pay-as-you-earn plan, most notably with its payment cap and its shorter 20-year forgiveness option. But there is something here called IBR for new borrowers. And what that means is if you didn't have any loans as of July 1st of 2014, it's basically the same plan as pay-as-you-earn. It does have that payment cap. It does have that 20-year taxable forgiveness option. Again, we don't see a lot of physicians, especially anesthesiologists, pursuing long-term loan forgiveness anyway, but I just want to point that out that they are phasing out the pay-as-you-earn program next year. Current participants will be grandfathered in. They won't kick you out of the program, but they won't let you get on it after that time next year. Okay, so a lot of changes going on right now with the income-driven repayment plans. If you want more detailed information about these, I just put a 30-minute video on our website at studentloanprofessor.com just talking about all the differences in income-driven repayment plans and breaking down the timelines for the changes and do a really deep dive there. So I would encourage you to check that out if you have more questions about these programs. But just a quick example here, if I have $250,000 in debt, where I'm normally racking up $1,250 in interest a month with a $2,800 monthly payment on an income-driven repayment plan, and this new SAVE plan in particular, most residents are going to have a $0 payment in PGY 1 and 2, and payments, depending on your exact income and AGI, probably around $200 a month. From there on out, and the interest savings of that is just phenomenal. Imagine if you're at 350 as osteopathic physicians. Let's not beat around the bush, right? Osteopathic schools tend to cost more than most allopathic schools. So many of you sitting in the room probably have 350,000 in student loan debt, and your interest subsidy here is way higher than what I'm showing here. So a great benefit there. We are excited about the new SAVE plan in most situations. Now, return to payment is obviously coming up. That's forefront on everyone's mind. So technically, payments resume 9/1, even though the servicers put a temporary forbearance in place. So most of you should have payments showing either October 1st or sometime in October. Now, if you were on an income-driven repayment plan, most of you graduated from school during the CARES Act payment and interest pause, so you haven't been on an IDR plan. But if you were, then they are still looking at your original recertification date, not the year, but the month and day. And if your date falls within March, then they're going to push between now and March, they're going to push your recertification out a full year. But if your recertification date is more than 6 months out, or in this case, after March 1st, then they are going to keep that in place. So if your recertification is, say, in June, it will remain June, in this case, June of 2024. Okay, so if you have more questions of that, you're welcome to email me. I'll give you my email address at the end. I can explain that a little bit better. But they are following that. And then very important here, if you were already on the SAVE plan, or excuse me, the repay plan, they are automatically switching you to the SAVE plan. You don't have to do anything. And more importantly, you don't have to recertify your income. However, if you want to get on the SAVE plan, let's say you're on IVR pay as you earn, you have to manually apply for it, which will require you to provide new income documentation. So think about that. Are the benefits of the SAVE plan going to outweigh the fact that you're having to show higher income? Those of you, if you were on an IDR plan before, you probably had tax returns from 2019, 2020, and now you're going to have to show current tax returns. So think about that gap in income there. In a lot of cases, we recommend borrowers actually wait until the certification comes due and then apply for the SAVE plan at that point, but ride that out based off that old income documentation and the payment equivalent it provides you. One more thing here, there's a bad problem right now with borrowers that have been put in the 10-year payment plan and their servicers not putting them in their appropriate income-driven repayment plan. And there are just ridiculous hold times, 5, 6, 7, even 10 hours some people are getting just to call in to try to get that fixed. It's a major, major problem right now. Now, public service loan forgiveness. After, I think, 12 years of giving these talks to residents, this is going to be the first time I have not done a deep dive into public service loan forgiveness, and a few reasons. Number one, we have limited time today. Two, there haven't been a lot of major changes to the PSLF program. So if you're already somewhat familiar with it, then I don't need to cover it again. If you're not, I do have another webinar on our site. We did one for Johns Hopkins a couple of months ago that does a deep dive into PSLF. So you can find that again on the website. But number three, and most practically, we don't see a lot of anesthesiologists pursuing public service loan forgiveness because most of you end up working through for-profit physicians groups and that they don't qualify for PSLF. But I want to cover this very quickly. It's a direct loan only program. Most of you do have direct loans. You have to be on an income-driven repayment plan and make 120 on-time payments. So roughly 10 years, but they are counting the number of payments there. So that could put you a little bit past 10 years. Do you have any gaps in your employment, so on and so forth. And you must be directly employed by either a government institution or a 501c3 nonprofit. So while many anesthesiologists find themselves working in, say, a nonprofit hospital day in and day out, usually it is a third party group, again, that contracts with that hospital. So you're not technically an employee, right? You're an employee of that group and you're just a contractor in the hospital. That does not qualify, except if you have any interest in working in California and Texas, because their state laws are very strict and basically prohibit physicians from being directly employed through nonprofit hospitals, new waivers or a special rule was just announced starting July 1, where doctors in only these two states, if they're contracting in a nonprofit, that nonprofit hospital can actually certify them for public service loan forgiveness, and they can then get credit for it. So for groups who don't traditionally get PSLF, like anesthesia, emergency, radiology, that have similar employment to you, that is going to open those doors in Texas and California. At least we think that it is. We don't see any reason why your specialty will be included. So for those who might be working in those states or considering moving to those states, that is worth noting there. But certainly, an income-driven or payment plan with those relatively low payments and roughly a 10-year time frame, this is a really, really great way to get your loans forgiven if you do see that opportunity. I've got a client now who went to work for a VA hospital right out of training, and part of the reason he took that job is because he wanted public service loan forgiveness. All right. When you're using any of these income-driven or payment plans, either short-term or long-term, they can get quite complex, right? The fact that they're based off our U.S. tax code to start with, we all know how complicated that is. But there's a lot of opportunity here to squeeze additional savings out of these programs. If you're thinking about, well, how does my spouse income come into play? Does my state, am I getting in a community property state? You can Google that. There's 9 states that are called community property where the rules are a little bit different. Think about your income projections. Like if you're moonlighting, if your income goes up for a couple of years moonlighting, but comes back down if you do that final year fellowship and they won't let you moonlight, there's ways you can work that to your advantage and use income documentation other than your high moonlighting income from the previous tax year. Okay, so when you think about what sort of income do I want to use, what are my income projections, you always want to be thinking about what can I do to demonstrate or document a lower income, even if it's only temporary, like when physicians transition from training to practice and they're technically out of work for a month or two. We encourage our clients to recertify during that time, basically claim no income, and that brings their payment way down for a 12-month payment period and saves them a lot more money. So just think about your strategy here. At the end of the day, strategy is really the key to saving on these programs. Anyone can sign up for pay or repay or whatever the program is, but there's a big difference between signing up for a plan and simply paying what they tell you to, and actually being proactive about how you're navigating the plan, especially if you're considering some sort of loan forgiveness option. All right. Now, refinancing is a very, very popular strategy for anesthesiologists specifically, especially when you get into your practicing years. So this refers to going out, getting a private loan from a private lender at a better interest rate than what you might be currently carrying on your federal loans. For instance, if I took $250 and I could refi it down from 6% to say 3.5% on a 10-year loan, well, that just saved me $36,000. Again, if I had a higher debt level, that's going to save me even more. All right. So that's a great way to reduce the cost of your debt and have a very, very simple loan repayment strategy that doesn't involve your tax returns or changing legislation or married filing separate or any of that kind of stuff. Now, interest rates are high right now, of course, so there's not a lot of people refinancing at this very moment, but I am a firm believer that rates will come back down. Let's give it a year or two, and this window will open back up. Watch out for refinancing during training. We usually do not recommend that, especially with the new SAVE plan and its generous interest subsidies. But there are a few lenders that will be, sending you promotions, talking about resident refinances. Use caution with those. They are an option you can consider. But generally speaking, we recommend waiting until close to practice before you refinance. Because when you do this, you give up all of your federal benefits. PSLF is off the table, interest subsidies are off the table. So sometimes you don't want to do this too early. And then lo and behold, you do end up taking a nonprofit job, or you don't launch into your career as quick as you thought you might. And you kind of wish you hadn't jumped the gun on that, because this is a one-way street. There's no way to undo this. Once you do a refi, there's no way to go back to federal loan status or benefits. So just make sure you're prepared to walk away from those benefits. This is something that we do for free. If you want us to help you walk through the process and weigh your options and see if refinancing is a good fit for you, and if so, shop out the lenders to help you find the best deal. That's something we do at no cost. We charge to explore the different IDR plans and forgiveness and all that. But if you're mainly interested in refinance, that is something we'll help you with at no cost, because the lenders pay us a finder's fee. And then finally, as we wrap up, if you're interested in exploring your different options, getting a grip on the SAVE plan, seeing if an income-driven repayment plan might make sense for you short-term or long-term, we actually run these numbers out on a screen share via Zoom. You're watching us do the analysis. We're showing you comparison short-term and long-term, and we'll help you with any paperwork that's needed. Maybe you need to consolidate, apply for a plan, certify your PSLF, deal with something with your servicer. All of that is included in the initial consultation. It lasts about an hour. When I say we've met with over 10,000 borrowers, this is what I'm talking about. We have done these consultations for over 10,000, mostly physicians, over the last 8 years. And so it's something that is well received among the community and tends to be a relatively good value. And for your particular group, you get a 15% discount. Okay, so I think that brings the cost to like $350, something like that. But we do have a discount through AOCA. So you see the discount code there. You can type that in when you register, and you'll see where to put that in. But scan the QR code here if you'd like more information on that, or you can go to our website at studentloanprofessor.com to get more information. We have an annual service to complement that, kind of a subscription where you do a meeting with us every year and have access to your advisor throughout the year, just in case something comes up. That's completely voluntary, and we can tell you more about that during the consultation. And again, the refinancing suitability is absolutely free. All right. So I know that was very fast. I'm technically over my 20 minutes here, but I hope you got at least a little bit of value out of that. There's just so much going on with student loans right now. I tried to cover the things that I think are going to be most relevant to you. But again, if you want more information, go to our website, check out the IDR recording, check out the full resident webinar. It lasts about an hour that breaks down all of these things and a few more topics, and you should be able to find what you need. And then, of course, if you want a one-on-one meeting, we'd love to do that for you as well. All right. Enjoy the rest of today's events. I know you got a great agenda where you're going to have a lot of great courses today. So I do hope you have a great weekend, and we look forward to hopefully being a resource to some of you. All right. Take care.
All right. Our next speaker is Dr. Jessica Geller. Dr. Geller is an associate professor of anesthesiology at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, clinical service chief of pediatric anesthesiology, section chief of pediatric comprehensive pain medicine, and director of perioperative services at Children's Nebraska, and serves as chair of the Children's Specialty Physicians Board of Directors at Children's Nebraska. She has served on the board of governors for the AOCA since 2020 and has been the chair of the Professional Education Committee since 2021. Today, Dr. Geller will be speaking on conflict collision strategies to manage difficult conversations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Geller.
For the audience here, I was in the second class at Lecon Bradenton. I served in the U.S. Army, crazy background, and I got my MBA while working full-time. I graduated in May. So it's more just to tell you that there are some more crazy cool things you can do when you're on the other side of it. So what I'm hoping to do today, no conflict of interest, is talk about difficult conversations that we can have when you're an anesthesiologist, strategies to negotiate a difficult conversation to a positive outcome, but really look at examples of how to implement those. One of my favorite classes I took in my MBA course was negotiations, and which was really fruitful because we renegotiated our contracts this year. And yeah, I played hardball pretty bad because there's a lot of shifts of people moving around the country in anesthesia, as a lot of people looking to have appropriate value assigned with the market adjustments. And so we got over 10% increase. But negotiations really comes down to how can you enter a conversation and have the other person receive it as a casual, mutual agreement with respect. So I'm going to go over some of those considerations and strategies. But part of this is also really looking at difficult conversations you're going to have throughout your career. And so I'll give some examples for different types of interactions, but whether it's with patients, patients' families, or colleagues, or people you're competing with, you're going to engage in difficult conversations a lot more than maybe you're comfortable with. So I'm going to help you along with that. So let's define what a difficult conversation is. It is a planned discussion about an uncomfortable topic. Now, not all of them are planned, but this is the definition. Or a negative experience where the goal is to share different perspectives, build mutual understanding, and develop respect. But the goal is never to persuade or win. I think when people's innate sense of, I mean, we're all very competitive. We're type A. We went into this because we're really passionate about what we do. But the goal really is to try not to have them feel like you're trying to one-up each other in the conversation, because you're really not going to get to what you want on the other side. So there's different types of conversations you can have. There's a what happened conversation. There's a feelings conversation. There's an identity conversation. And when you look at those three different types, the what happened one really is a conversation that occurs when there are discrepancies between you and the other person's perception of the events. So this is really an information exchange. It can turn into a us versus them if you're not careful. So you want to have the strategy approaching a what happened conversation where you don't want to assume the other person's wrong. Assume positive intent in every single situation. That'll save you most of the time. And then consider how the events may be perceived from their perspective, remain calm and review the facts. Be as objective as possible. One of the biggest downfalls I've seen here is when people react rather than respond to a situation. And so you're looking at information exchange and gathering. So what happened? Tell me from your side. One of the other challenges that people face is when you see something one way, frequently it seems like that is the only way it can be. And being able to then step back and say there's another angle to this, and understanding what that other side of the conversation is, somebody else's experience, somebody else's perception of it, takes active engagement. I've seen many colleagues hear one side of a story and then react to that rather than gathering the other side, putting it together, and then coming up with a response. So taking yourself out of a situation where you think, well, that was really the only way it should have gone, and because it deviated from that, then we need to change what happens in the future. Try to set that aside, because one of the facets of beauty in anesthesia is there are sometimes 20 different ways to do the same thing. We actually love that part. So if you look at it from that lens, it's very helpful to say there could be cultural, there could be how you were trained, there could be circumstantial evidence from the scenario that all change the frame of reference. When you talk about a feelings conversation, that's a hard one. It refers to the emotions ingrained in a difficult conversation. So you don't want to be critical. You want to be kind and considerate, empathetic listener. We need to listen for 2/3 of the time and speak 1/3 of the time. People will tell you what they need if you pause and listen and don't fill the uncomfortable silence, because that's what we tend to do here in the States as a culture. When you are being an empathetic listener, you're giving them space to share their side of the story, be open to hearing it, and then you can also set boundaries when discussing emotions. Well, let's not go down this path, let's refocus, type of thing. So when you're doing an identity conversation, this is a conversation where it may define someone involved in the discussion at hand. You're wanting to not let the issue affect your personal self-image or take it personally. Consider whether or not the other party is doing this as well, and keep it about the facts and the issue at hand. Honestly, when I'm coaching my own, I have 28 anesthesiologists, 9 CRNAs, a bunch of amazing anesthesia techs and NPs, etc. being able to change their, calm the emotions and turn it into an objective conversation and stay on the facts, I think is the first important facet of being able to have a really good exchange in a difficult conversation. Here are some really amazing books. Crucial Conversations, The Art of Saying No, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. He's a FBI hostage negotiator. Yes, most of the things we're doing, even when we're discussing with families what we need to do, could be construed as a hostage negotiation. I even feel that way sometimes trying to advocate for certain modalities of treatment for patients with surgeons who have their own line of sight, and you're trying to ensure that they're considering that facet. No, we're not saying that they're terrorists per se, although I work with peds. Every once in a while kids could be little terrorists. But has some really, really great ways to frame it that you're not trying to get people to say yes, but you're trying to get them first to say no. And we're going to go over some of those things. But if I were to recommend one of the three, that would be the one, especially as you're going to go into interviews and people are going to ask you on the spot about how you're going to do this, how you're going to do that. This would be something that would arm you with really good responses to turn it around. To give an example, just to keep the mood light, I love telling this story, and I'm sure most of you haven't heard it. So it's just the beginning of the pandemic, 10-year-old boy who is about to have a procedure, but now we're all wearing masks. And as you can hear, I have an accent. I'm originally from Australia, married to a German. Some people say you have some German in there. We influence each other. But I go in to talk to the family, and they're bilingual, speak both English and Spanish, affirmed that English was fine. As I go through it, the kid is looking at his mum, and then he looks at me, and then he looks at his mum, and he goes, "Do you understand anything she's saying?" She goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Cuando quieres yo explicar todos en español." And then I did the whole thing in Spanish. And he looks at me. I guess you could go bombastic side-eye on this one. And he says, "Your accent sucks in 2 languages." I'm like, you know what? That doesn't change that you're going to get the best anesthesia today. And that's an N of 1 opinion. So kids can be pretty crazy, but they're in a stressful situation. And so you interpret it as that and not a personal slight. I just thought it was cute, actually. So let's talk about strategies to negotiate difficult conversations. First, you want to establish rapport. We want the same thing. The goal is the same, those types of things. You're establishing rapport and a connection. You want to frame a question with a no-based response. I'll give you some examples of those. When you get people to overcome first, getting to say no, then when you've already overcome that part where they're going to be like, "Oh, I'm going to want to say no to this," if you get that no out, it's out of the way. So frame questions for a no-based response. Active listening, we just discussed that. Mirroring, so you're turning it back around. I hear this is what you're saying. Labeling what they're feeling. It sounds like you're frustrated. Communicate clearly. Set a deadline. Loose in the ether follow-up dates doesn't give anybody any kind of confidence. And then have a lasting impression. Your last impression is a lasting impression. If normally you lead in with positive, put that to the end and lead out with positive. I really love working with you. I love that even though we don't always see eye to eye, that we really try to engage to take care of these patients the best way possible. So the other facet is never take advice from a person you wouldn't trade places with. You found this in your journey right now. Has everybody heard someone say, "Sure you want to do that? That's really hard." I can give you 1,000 examples. And here I am on the other side, leader of things that if I didn't say, "You know what, you don't get to make decisions for me, I'm going to do it anyway." Never take advice from a person who is, sometimes they're projecting their insecurities on you. Criticism is a form of advice. It's not a great behavior, but nobody who's doing better than you will ever criticize you. It's a function of people trying to pull you down. So I'm adding those things in there to have you consider being open to learning and coaching, but also not to allow people to have the control they're trying to exert on you, because only you can have the strength in your career going forward. Because all of you know you're going to be fantastic doctors. That's why you got to this place in the first place. And there are going to be others that feel like that you succeeding. I've actually had people tell me this before. I don't want to hear about your achievements anymore. It makes me feel like crap in my own division. So I stopped talking about all the things unless people asked. But it isn't supposed to frame that way. It should be, well, you're part of the group. You're doing cool things. Therefore, all of us are winning because that represents our group. But that's not always the way people see it, because they have these gut feelings of imposter syndrome, and they're doing this, and if I'm not, does that make me look bad in comparison? So let's talk about controversial conversations and talk about disclaimers. These are some topics I just don't talk about. Don't put it on social media. Don't go out there and do those. I mean, some versions of this, you know, I'm not gonna tell you can avoid altogether. There are some very proud, very respectful ways to demonstrate your religious beliefs, but politics, religion, polarizing opinions. Do you do sleep training? What do you think about circumcision? Did you vaccinate your kids? These are all things that aren't going to change your management of somebody, and then probably not going to enrich your relationship. If they ask you, what do you think about this? Don't be trapped. Say, oh, I don't have strong opinions on that. You know, everybody has to make their own decisions there. I think it's important to try to steer away from these kind of situations where, unless you have a mutual relationship that's close outside of work, that you would discuss that. What about dissenting preferences in music in the OR? I don't know. I don't always like to listen to some hardcore country in the middle of Nebraska. I lean more towards dance music, techno and EDM, but then I play that and they're like, "Ooh, I can't stand that." So anyway, just examples of tolerance, but also not engaging if it's not necessary. Now, navigating controversial topics in conversations, it can be challenging, but there are some strategies to help. Start with an open mind, establish common ground, look for areas of agreement, shared values, use active listening. That's where you listen carefully to the other perspective, try to understand their point of view, and then use those techniques of active listening to paraphrase, summarize, and ask clarifying questions. If you told somebody a story about a cool thing that happened at a concert you were at, and they turned around and said, "So you were really 10 rows from the front and you got to make eye contact with them? That's crazy." You have now told them that you weren't just coming up with your next response and example and idea in your head while you were listening. You were actively listening to them. Avoid personal attacks. Stay focused to issue at hand and avoid attacking the other person personally, purposely or inadvertently. Acknowledge their emotions, because everybody has a right to feel the way they feel. Seek common ground, know when to take a break. Sometimes you're not getting anywhere. You're like, you know, I think we've had some really good discourse, and while we don't need to agree to disagree, how about we just, you know, sleep on it, and we can come and return to this topic at another time if we'd like. By using these strategies, it's possible to have productive and respectful conversations, even with controversial topics. So one of the default answers that I give is I say, as a rule, I don't discuss topics like that don't affect patient care or could negatively impact our relationship if we have differences of opinion. I care too much about my professional career, and I care too much about you to have that interfere with our relationship. This is interesting, because I actually opened OpenAI and I asked OpenAI, what would be the top things you can do to navigate a difficult conversation? I find it interesting to navigate that new tool. It's going to be part of, eventually, our own documentation. Start with a positive tone, state your concerns clearly and specifically, focus on the patient's best interests, offer solutions, be open to feedback. You see, it still ties in, but this is pulling from all of the different things stated online. I just found it interesting. So, all right. Let's say you know there's an impending difficult conversation. So that could be delivering bad news. That's a hard one, but you have to be prepared that that can happen, and that may even require you to go chat with somebody to try to prepare yourself to be able to go and deliver bad news. That could be a disclosure event in your training. I mean, even as a med student, I went and delivered bad news about confirmed brain death when I did an ICU rotation. It wasn't easy, but I was willing to engage to try to be that compassionate, informative person. Delaying or rescheduling a case, conflict resolution with a colleague, the disclosure, and negotiation with non-medical leadership. Now, one of the strategies I employed, which not everybody's going to do, is if I want to negotiate with leadership that is non-medical, I got an MBA so I could speak their language. It was very effective. But that being said, you can still try to understand the references you need to make in order for you to be on the same ground. Because if you lean towards your typical everyday medical language, they may not be able to identify with you and understand what you're aiming for. So you're going to identify the issue, choose the right time and place, plan your approach, consider the other person's perspective and anticipate their reactions, practice, listen actively, stay calm, and identify solutions where you work together to find a solution or compromise that works for both parties. This can work with many different examples, so we're going to go through some of those. When you establish rapport, you want to set the tone, show empathy, and respond versus react. So you want to know your audience. Sometimes you have to adjust the style you use because of culture, what breakdown there is, even language barriers. One of the biggest patient experience feedbacks we get is that those that don't have English as a primary language feel like they don't get the same explanation, treatment, and discourse that those that speak English do. That actually is across the board. And part of the way to overcome that is to sit down, use the translator, and ensure you ask them, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? But knowing your audience and adjusting to that. I want to give an example of a parental concern. There was a kid who had severe gastroparesis, needed an EGD, had a history of having large volume in his stomach, and therefore when he had an EGD, he was intubated. They waited until he was fully awake, protecting his airway, and then they removed the endotracheal tube. In that, he was coughing on the tube, and it was when the parent was driving home with the child that they looked in the rearview mirror and he was looking sideways, and she saw red in his sclera, like he had busted a couple of vessels from the coughing on the tube. I had 2 different people call that family member who was very upset, scared that something bad happened to their kid because this looks very scary. So when those didn't yield a response where the parent felt heard, they asked me to intervene. They're like, we got to send Jessica in. They say I can sell ice to Eskimos. I don't actually agree with that, but I try very hard. So I started, when I called the parent, I said, I'm understanding that this is what was happening. Wow, that sounds like that was really scary to see that in the rearview mirror. And I connected with her, I set the tone, I kept the late night PM DJ voice. That's from that same book. And I said, wow, how did that make you feel? You're not trying to cast blame. And then I turned around and I said, these are the typical ways that we go about trying to protect your child from aspirating and having a really bad negative event. In this situation, that increased the pressure and that led to that. And you know what? We're going to put some notes in there to try to find an even better, smoother strategy. But there wasn't anything that was actually done wrong to your child. The eyes were protected, everything. And she felt like she was heard by the end of the conversation, which is 90% of what they're going through, is they feel like that they're falling on deaf ears because they're not in the medical field, and why don't you care about my child as much as I do? So know your audience, set a tone, show empathy, and then respond. You can see that would be scary to look at your kid in the rear view mirror and say, what happened here? So first you want to get to know. All right. So you call someone, you want to ask them a question, but they don't owe you any time. How do you get them to talk to you and create time for you? Is now a bad time to talk? Because if you say, do you have any time right now? How many of you have time on any given day to do anything? I don't. but is now a bad time to talk? If it isn't good then they will offer a reasonable substitute. Not now, but probably in 10 minutes. Is it a ridiculous idea that I would come and rotate with you maybe for one day in the OR so I could glean from the experiences that you have? I've heard wonderful things about you. Are you against somebody coming and rotating with you? Do you disagree that medical students should be able to come and have some exposure in the area that they're most excited to potentially train? And then let's say you've had a conversation, you haven't gotten the response back. Have you given up on writing a letter from me? I don't know if I'd use it for that specific one, but if you get to know first, no, it's not a bad time right now, or no, it's not a ridiculous idea. It's easy then, you've overcome that. Let's get to know first. So when you use that, that replaces, have you got a few minutes to talk, is now a good time. It replaces them answering, yes, it's a bad time, but I can talk with you at another time. It really does allow them the opportunity to solve the problem, that it is a bad time or it isn't a bad time, and then offer a solution. Active listening. Yes, there's kangaroos. The mum's talking to the baby. Anyone know what a baby kangaroo is? Joey, nice. So active listening, rather than listening to hear, active listening demands that you listen with the intention of understanding. So if you don't understand, what are you going to do? You're going to repeat back in case, I've done this with my kids, with other relationships, and sometimes I have an amazing husband here. He's not medical. He's from Germany. Every once in a while we have a lost in translation conversation, or I'm not actively listening, and I'm like, I heard this, and it's completely off left field. So it allows them to know what you heard, and they can fill in the gaps. Labeling is where somebody is expressing something to you, and it may not be what they're saying, but how the emotion behind it. You say, wow, it sounds like you're really frustrated. Yes, I am frustrated. You're actively listening so that you can understand. And what happens if you don't understand? Then you ask calibrated questions. You're going to say, wait, so what I'm hearing is you're unable to start this case at this time because this other case is going over in this room, and you're frustrated because the nursing isn't offering up staff so that we can overlap a little bit. Do you have something else going on later that I can try to help you get these things done in a timely manner so that you can get to it? Asking calibrated questions is showing that you're actively listening. Mirroring is where you repeat the phrase back. You're concerned about the delay. You don't expect blood loss. I'm hearing that it sounded like an overdose because Narcan was given. This is actually a specific complaint that occurred when somebody gave some fentanyl. They gave a little naloxone. Then the surgeon goes out before the anesthesiologist talks to them and says, yeah, they overdosed them on fentanyl, so they gave them some Narcan and they're fine now. And of course, the moment the anesthesiologist goes there, they're like, you overdosed my child and gave him Narcan? That is not the whole story. It was nothing like that. But being able to mirror is important. Labeling, seems like, it sounds like, it looks like, it feels like. Communicating clearly. What makes you ask that? How would I go about that? Somebody wants to task you with doing something else you literally don't have time for, but they're trying to tell you you don't have a choice. Well, how would I go about that? I'm going to have to give up this agreement over here in order to make room for that one. I have a different lecture on Tuesday on how to say no to some things, so we'll go over those things then. But it's not a zero-sum game. The best negotiations are those where both parties feel they gained something, and the goal is to find a solution that satisfies both. It shouldn't be you both coming in and one has to lean back and the other one leans forward. And no, compromise isn't always the answer. But if you remove emotions from the discussion, when emotions take over, the listening ability is diminished. Think about when you tell somebody their family member has cancer. They hear nothing else because the emotions are so open and raw. But if somebody is getting emotional about something, sometimes that's when you say, well, let's take a step back. I want to hear what you have to say, but I know that, this is very sensitive right now. Don't bring in what you've done before to demonstrate success, but find out the problems you're able to solve. And don't turn everything that you're discussing into an example of how you experienced that before. There was a recent event where one of our nurses who had a reconstructive augmentation after a prophylactic double mastectomy when her sister died, it ruptured, and someone in the OR was helping her up, and she was very emotional, was bringing back all of these feelings, and that person said, in their mind, just to try to have solidarity, well, now you know what it feels like to be flat. I've been that my whole life when they had one side go flat. Bringing in your own experience or saying, if it makes you feel better, my dad died 10 years ago when somebody just loses a family member, it isn't the time always to bring it and turn it around back to you. It's okay to not give examples of yourself. Set a deadline. A lot of times, if you want something done, you got to send it in an email. Let's summarize what happened and let me know if I'm missing something, and can we meet on this, or this date. I find if you give a range, people, it's now I have to calculate and look on my calendar. But if you say I can only do on the 28th between 2 and 4 or whatever, I get actually faster responses that way. And then lasting impression. Ask yourself the following questions at the end of a difficult conversation. Did we reach the plan, goal, or solution? Did the other person and I leave the meeting with an action item? So what I'm hearing is these are the things we need to work on. Did I document that the conversation occurred and recorded key points? And did I schedule a follow-up if needed? But also end with a good impression. We have one course we took in our institution called where they taught us that you should start any conversation with a family member, a patient, or a colleague using the heart, head, heart method. Hi, I heard you do really great things. Then you deliver bad news, and then you end with, things are going to be great, and you do such a wonderful job. They call it the heart, head, heart sandwich. I don't know that it works as effectively as people realize or intend, but if you end on a positive note, that's the lasting impression. You can lead in with something great, but then the last thing they remember is that you talked about something that was hard. So leaving a lasting impression. So how we're doing with time. I got 5 minutes. Julie? Okay. All right, anesthesiologist and surgeon. That one I feel you have to build a rapport with the surgeon, and when they know that you're trying to be efficient, safe, and you have that mutual respect, I find that I can have more of them now engage in epidurals and spinals and caudal analgesia and regional. Oh, I don't know if I want to do regional. I'll just inject some local. It's going to take too much time, blah, blah, blah. And then you can have actually proper discourse and say, faster returning to gastric function, and then we don't need to use so many opioids, and we're trying to minimize exposure, etc. Building rapport is really critical, but always be respectful in your discourse and accept that sometimes the answer is going to be no, because then it'll be yeses later. If you arrive in a hostile environment in the pre-op realm, sometimes you need to say, I want to go over everything with you. I know it's very important, so I'm going to step out and give you a moment, or is there something you need before we begin the discussion? You don't want to continue to be navigating that hostile environment. Sometimes you need to bring somebody else with you, but disclosure and those types of things, I think that you really do need to come in pairs, whether it's the nurse, the surgeon and you, or another colleague. So another thing I do, as I work with peds all the time, I'll walk in and the kid's on the phone. I'm like, all right, you need to put that phone down. I'm going to talk very fast, but we need to go over some things. And if they keep going, I take it out of their hand and I put it down. Parents are always supportive of that. Of course, I'm distracting them with the accent when I lead in, and they're like, what is that? Huh? Okay. you use the tools you have, right? But I won't continue if they're on the phone. I do the same with parents because they'll say they never got talked to about it, so getting the attention. But you don't want to create a hostile environment, so you're trying to do it in a playful way. hey, good thing we know how to pause things now. We didn't get to do that back in the day, but we can pause it and then you can keep playing your game in a moment. Wow, that's cool. I play Zelda on the Nintendo Switch. Do you have one of those? Yeah, cool. So engaging and calming the mood. And then we have talking to administrators. I think this will be more of a conversation as you move on in your career, but as you're negotiating, talk to somebody ahead of time. Arm yourself with responses that are going to give you the ability to negotiate for the best you can. If you don't ask, you'll never know. So that's the best advice I can give you. You're not being hostile or too crazy if you say, you know, I have a certain range that I'm looking at, but I really want to understand what you guys are offering because there's so many different models. And I found that a lot of institutions before, when you were looking for jobs, they would lead you all the way through, and then they would tell you what they were going to offer you at the end. And if I knew at the end what it was, I wouldn't even have started the process. For instance, I interviewed down in Texas. They offered me $280. I went to, this is 100 years ago, it's way, $280 and 14 days of vacation. And then I'm in Omaha, and at that time they offered me $374 plus 9 weeks of vacation. Vastly different. Did I need to go down to Texas? If I knew that if I had a 2 in the front of the salary, I wouldn't even have considered it. But it's Houston. Everybody wants to be here. No, the traffic sucks. Anyway, nothing against anyone who likes Houston. You know, everybody has their perfect little niche. But it isn't unreasonable in this day and age to say, what is the typical salary and benefits, etc., as you're going into there, because that is part of your equation. You just have to be creative in doing that. But ask for more, even if you're going to get no. What's the worst that can happen? No, we don't do that. And then you'll have these key takeaways, different ways to look at an anesthesiologist and a colleague, and then practicing, start with the no, actively listen. Ask about a mutual goal, usually patient care and efficiency is a really good one. But also be humble and authentic. People know when you're being fake. They can read that a mile away. And that's it.
Thanks for having me today. I'm Aoca St. I'm General Counsel at American Oncology Network. We're a nationwide medical oncology practice across 17 states, almost 200 providers. So every day, all I do is work with our physician partners and work on strategy and with leadership. So happy to be here today. Today I'm going to be talking to you about defensive documentation, a little bit about medical malpractice, and what you can do to mitigate your risk if you do have a bad day or, you know, a potential adverse event, how you can protect yourself. So, disclaimer, the lawyer in me, the information I'm providing today is on my own behalf and not on behalf of my company, American Oncology Network. So just take that for what it's worth. So let's start with what is an adverse event. An adverse event is an event that results in an undesirable clinical outcome, not caused by underlying disease or something that prolonged the patient's stay, caused permanent harm, or required life-saving intervention. Adverse events can be preventable or non-preventable. There can be ameliorable adverse events that, while not preventable, could have been less harmful if care had been provided differently. And then there can be adverse events that are caused due to the negligence of the provider or the institution. Patient harm is harm that is caused to a patient as the result of medical care or in a healthcare setting, including the failure to provide necessary medical care. So, building on what Jessica talked about just a bit ago, I'm going to talk a bit today about how I would suggest you communicate with a patient or a patient's family in response to some of these challenges that you may face as a provider. To start, I think it's really important that you only approach a patient or a patient's family to discuss an adverse event when you are in a reasonable emotional state. Obviously, the patient and the patient's family they will likely be devastated that they or their loved one experienced an adverse event, but it's hard for you as the provider too. So I think it's very important that you first take care of yourself and your own emotional state before you walk into the room to talk to the patient or the patient's family members. The information you provide should be honest and consistent. You'll want to ensure that what you're saying doesn't change over time, though of course as an investigation or follow-up occurs, you may learn more and therefore you'll share different information, but it's just very important to remain consistent. Also avoid speculating or guessing what may have happened or sharing information prematurely. Again, the idea of, oh, well, they overdosed your patient and that's why they had to administer Narcan. I mean, those are the types of comments that are very harmful to the discussions between the provider and the patient or the patient's family. And then also make sure you let the patient or the patient's family know what more is being done, not only to follow up in their particular instance, but also to alleviate this risk to other patients in the healthcare setting, because patients and families want to know that you're doing what you can to prevent what happened to them from happening to others. So there can be an adverse event, but not necessarily medical malpractice. So there are various factors that must be proven in a medical malpractice claim. The 4 factors that must exist and be proven, including that there was a doctor-patient relationship, that the standard of care in the relationship was not upheld, that this failure to uphold the standard of care resulted in patient harm, and that the patient harm resulted in damages. So if these 4 factors are not all present and must be proven by the plaintiff in a medical malpractice case, so the burden of proof is on the plaintiff, not the defendant, and as the provider, you would be the defendant in that case. If these 4 factors aren't proven, then a medical malpractice case will not be successful. So what that means is even if you have an adverse event, even if a patient experiences harm, even if there was some type of negligence in the care that was provided, that doesn't mean that there will be a successful medical malpractice claim brought against you. That said, we live in a society where people bring lawsuits about anything and everything. So it's very important that you recognize that even if a claim is brought against you or a patient or a patient's representative brings in a lawyer and they start to request records or they subpoena information, that doesn't necessarily mean you were guilty or you did anything wrong. There's a significant process to prove that you were liable for that patient's harm as well as any damage that was provided or any damage that resulted. One thing to keep in mind, going back to that conversation with you and the patient or the patient's family, angry or suspicious patients or their families are far more likely to get a lawyer involved than patients or families who feel that you are compassionate and caring and communicative and transparent. So ultimately, poor or absent communication as well as poor or absent documentation, which is what we're going to get to shortly, can really hamper your defense as well as a patient or family's willingness to work with you directly as opposed to going to a lawyer to pursue a medical malpractice claim. Okay. So talking about documentation, how can you protect yourself with documentation? And when we talk about documentation, it really is what is in the medical record. The medical record is the Bible when you document. If it's not in the medical record, it didn't exist. What you put in an email, what you jot down on your notepad, what you call and tell your APP or your office administrator, none of that matters. What matters is what is in the medical record. And as someone who, prior to joining American Oncology Network, was in-house counsel at an electronic medical record company, EMRs suck. They all suck. They're all terrible. None of them are user-friendly. It's not fun to utilize. But it's essential. It's essential to your practice. It's essential to defending yourself in litigation. My husband is a physician, and he always takes the approach when he documents that he literally wants another provider to be able to pick up a patient's chart and see where he left off and determine what next steps must be taken. Anesthesiology is a little bit of a different field, but still the idea is that the medical record must be accurate and it must be complete. So what I recommend is that you follow the FACTS acronym. You want the record to be factual, accurate, complete, timely, and tell the complete story. So chart in the record contemporaneously and thoroughly. Chart at the time you're performing the case, not the next day, not 10 days later. I recognize that you may not be required to complete the record for a period of time under medical staff bylaws or policies and procedures, but really that is not to your benefit to delay documenting the record. If you identify an error in what you've charted, make sure you correct that error promptly. And when I say correct, don't try to cover it up. Don't try to delete it. You add a note to the record to indicate whatever you noticed was an error, any type of inconsistency, and ideally you do that again as quickly as possible after your initial documentation. Be accurate, objective, and complete. Don't insert your emotions. Don't include anything in the record that could potentially be inflammatory or insulting, or again, anything that's guessing as to what may have happened with a patient. Just be as concise, accurate, and complete as possible. Make sure that any test results or consultation reports, as well as your conversations with patients and their families, are included in the medical record. Avoid repetitive copying and pasting, or just click, 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 like selecting all for everything. It's easy to do in the EMR at this point, and in your practice, you'll likely create templates, which is great in helping the efficiency of your work, but then can pose greater challenges when you have unique or nuanced patients and you aren't updating your record for that particular patient because you're just on autopilot and just copying and pasting from what you're typically accustomed to documenting. Make sure you include all patient communications. So one thing to keep in mind is that your communications with patients should be on a HIPAA compliant platform. So strongly recommend against texting patients, communicating with patients via social media. If you're going to use email, make sure it's an email system that's encrypted and therefore would be in compliance with HIPAA. Ideally, you communicate by phone or, and then again, if you communicate by phone, you'll want to document a note to the record so that it's detailed, the conversation that occurred. Or, nowadays, patient portals are great because all of that is HIPAA compliant communication, and it's very easy to be added to the record. If it's not done automatically, it's easy for you to transfer that over to the medical record. Be sure to document patient non-compliance or patient inconsistency in answers. So, for example, when you're doing your pre-anesthesia workup, you'll want to know what your patient's risk factors are. And when you're talking to them, make sure that you document what they've detailed as their comorbidities or their risk factors. You only know what you know. You know what they've shared with you. You know what the medical record of the other providers might state. But be sure to document all of that in the medical record because, again, if you have a bad outcome in a case, that's what you can rely on to say, well, I had no idea that this patient had an underlying heart condition or has experienced seizures in the past. That was never disclosed to me. This is what we talked about when I obtained consent from the patient. That was never discussed. And also make sure you document delegated tasks. So if you are delegating a task to a CRNA or to a nurse or to someone else in your office to obtain consent, make sure the medical record contains your delegation of that task. Ultimately, as the provider, I think you have the ultimate responsibility. So be sure that when you delegate something, that you are taking responsibility to see that has that delegation has been taken care of, that the work was actually done, the conversation was had. If someone else is helping you prepare your notes and document the medical record and you're signing off, don't just sign off. Actually read it, evaluate it, and confirm that it's accurate. So why is documentation important? So documentation reflects the quality of care you provided. Again, sometimes malpractice cases can be brought many years down the road. Each state has its own statute of limitations, which is the time period in which a plaintiff is permitted by law to bring a case. In many states, it's 2 years, but for minors, it's often to the age of majority and beyond. So if you are, working with peds, you may have, if a patient has a bad outcome or something occur at age 2, you could be on the hook and potentially facing a malpractice case 16 years later once they reach the age of majority. So again, obviously 16 years later, you're going to have no recollection of what happened in that case. And also that former child, that former minor, will not either. So the medical record is what dictates the quality of care you provided. Even if you provided amazing care to your patient, haphazard or incomplete medical documentation gives the impression that your care wasn't as good as it may have actually been. Again, meticulous records in a medical malpractice case, if you're actually in litigation, convey to the court that you provided good care, that you were careful, that you were meticulous, that you documented well. And even if there was a bad outcome, even if something occurred, and even if it was, in fact, malpractice, it was within the realm of human error. And that happens, right? You can't always get it right. You can't always do it perfectly. Medical documentation plays a part in almost all medical malpractice lawsuits. And I'd say 10 to 20% of med mal cases involve inaccurate, incomplete, or generic records, and it undermines a physician's defense. Sloppy records imply sloppy care, and as I said earlier, if it's not in the record, it didn't happen. So make sure everything that you would want to be able to utilize in defending yourself makes it into the medical record. So here I just include specific to anesthesia, kind of what would be documented in a case. So you have the pre-anesthesia evaluation where you get medical history, surgical history, medication list, allergies. You do your examination, review of diagnostic data, come up with the anesthesia plan, and obtain informed consent, which is very important. Yes, it might terrify patients, it might scare them, but be all-inclusive in listing all of the potential risks of undergoing whatever form of anesthesia that you intend to provide in the case. During the case, you'll want to document, and most of the anesthesia equipment should also be able to provide outputs on patient monitoring and what has been done during the case, but you'll want to make sure you're documenting immediately after the case what medications were administered, what techniques you used, IV fluids, any significant or unusual events, and the status of the patient when the patient transferred to care in a post-op setting. Particularly, again, in your defense, what did the patient look like when they left your care? Because then, again, even if there's a bad outcome, you can say, well, the patient was in perfectly good state when they left me. There was no indication of a negative outcome, and that can help defend you against another provider who may have been involved in the care down the road. Post anesthesia, again, just details on specifics of what I would expect to see documented in the record. So I think I had, this might not be my most updated slide deck, so give me just a minute because I have it printed. I have a hypothetical to talk about as to what could be a way in which documentation comes into play during a malpractice case. So here's our hypothetical. A 45-year-old patient presents to an ambulatory surgery center for a septoplasty. A pre-procedure evaluation was completed by the anesthesiologist, and the only anesthesia-related risk noted was high blood pressure. The case proceeded without incident, but upon arrival in the post-anesthesia recovery unit, it was noted that the patient was not breathing and a code was called. So how could adequate documentation help protect the anesthesiologist in a potential claim for medical malpractice? Any ideas? Yeah. And then what about detailing what happened during the case? So the details on, again, the pre-surgery evaluation of the patient, and the fact that high blood pressure, again, was the only health risk noted based on conversations with the patient and review of the record, and the evaluation that you performed of the patient. And then what about what the patient's condition was like during the case? So making sure it's clear how the patient's care transpired while under your treatment during the surgery. Also, what medications were administered. So not only what medications, but dose and frequency. You'd be shocked at how many times it's unclear what dose of a medication a patient received is not clear in the record. And obviously, if a patient received a double dose of something or not enough of a certain medication, that can lead to a negative outcome. And that may not have actually been the case, but if it's not clear in the record what medication you administered, at what time, and at what dose, then you won't be able to use that to defend yourself down the road. Also, what was the interaction between you and your surgeon colleague, as well as the surgeon and the patient? So anything that you can provide, and again, it's not about casting blame or pointing fingers as to who may have been responsible or not responsible, but ultimately, if you can make clear that what you did not necessarily contribute to the patient's bad outcome, that's significant in your defense. Again, going back to this idea of what took place in your care versus what took place after your care. Additionally, from a documentation standpoint, if the patient was still in your care, how did you respond to that situation? So what steps did you take when you noticed the patient wasn't breathing? How did you handle the code? Who did you call? How quickly? When had you last evaluated the patient and known and identified the patient as being breathing and in good medical condition? All of that can be documented in the chart to help you defend yourself later. Right. And I mean, if you're not in the room when the episode occurs, it takes time for you to receive the call, and then it takes time for you to get there, right? Even if you're in-house and you're, nearby, just on another floor, minutes can make a significant difference. So being very clear about when you received the call, when you arrived, and again, if there was any reason for a delay between that time period, again, if you're all the way across, if we're in a hospital setting as opposed to an ASC, and you're all the way across the hospital, it can take you a while to get there. And that is not your fault. It wasn't in your control necessarily. It doesn't mean you did something wrong. It may contribute to the patient's outcome, but again, it indicates and allows you down the road to see in the chart, or allow others to see in the chart what you did to mitigate the risk to this patient. So important takeaways, I think, here. Chart in real time. Again, it's a pain. You're trying to provide the best care you can to your patients. You're trying to turn over, or the hospital's turning over rooms. You're trying to perform as many cases as possible. The last thing you want to deal with is charting in the medical record. But waiting until later in the day to chart is a mistake for many reasons. The surgeon will likely speak to the patient shortly after surgery. And what you don't want is, again, the surgeon to convey something that might not comport with what your recollection of the events might be. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to immediately communicate with the patient or the patient's family, but again, timely documentation of the record is really important. If you can participate in the conversation with the family after the case, I think that's helpful, and particularly if there's any type of negative outcome, that's definitely beneficial for you to engage in that conversation. And assuming that the event where the incident occurred was the OR when we were addressing anesthesiology, that OR is going to be turned over and used for other cases. So if something happened, you know, you need to make sure you and the administration and the other providers need to make sure you're addressing it and documenting quickly before that OR is turned over to other providers for other cases. Sometimes when the equipment is placed into use for the next patient, some of the data stored will no longer be available. So, you know, every piece of equipment is different, but again, if something negative occurred in your case, you'll want to make sure that you're obtaining copies or requesting copies of any data that was stored in the equipment for the time that you were performing your case. Make sure, again, you know, whatever was stored in the machine regarding vital signs, gas dosages, and ECG tracings, anything that was performed during the case, it's helpful to have actual output from the equipment when you're defending yourself down the road. If equipment failed or malfunctioned, then again, you'll want to make sure that's documented in the record and indicating what happened and what you know about whose responsibility it was will be really important. As I said at the very beginning, when something bad happens, it's devastating for the patient, but it's often devastating to the provider as well. And you may not even realize that you are in such a state of shock or mental turbulence in the moment until time has passed and you can finally get out of that like chaotic period and realize like, oh, maybe I should have done X, Y, or Z thing after the negative event occurred a little bit differently. So if you have in your mind what your plan will be if you ever have a bad outcome during a case, then you at least can follow that protocol that you've set for yourself and not necessarily be influenced by your shock or trauma at what occurred during your case. As I said, if you identify an inaccuracy or incomplete medical record, don't try to cover it up. Attempted cover-ups will be evident and it will be used against you. So, you know, ultimately, if you find that you weren't complete in your documentation in the record, you can add an addendum. You can add it as a late entry in the chart. The entry must be listed as a late entry to prevent allegations that you tampered with the record. And if an extended period of time has passed, I would suggest you contact your professional liability carrier, whoever's providing your medical malpractice coverage. If you're at a health system or a practice, you would talk to your practice administrators to gain access and find out what their recommendation is as to whether there should be a narrative prepared outside the record to detail why what you initially provided was, or what you initially documented was not accurate compared to what you identified down the road. 3, refrain from documenting outside the record unless recommended by counsel, including your professional liability carrier. 4, be cautious and truthful when communicating with the patient and family. It's essential to be truthful. So provide as much information as you can, but again, don't speculate, don't provide incomplete information, and make sure they know that you're continuing to follow up and investigate and do as much as you can to determine what went wrong with the patient. 5, follow up. So if you tell a patient or their family you're going to do something, follow through. And if for some reason you can't follow through or you're delayed in following through, remain in communication so that they know you haven't forgotten about them. It's really important to patients and their families to know that you care, that you're compassionate. And a lot of times that can result in a decision not to file a medical malpractice claim against you. Whereas if they feel you're hardened and you don't care and you're apathetic about what happened, they'll be more likely to want to vindicate and achieve some type of get back at you, essentially, because they feel that you didn't treat their loved one with the care that they deserved. As I said earlier, communicate verbally, in person, via the patient portal or HIPAA-compliant email platform. So no social media. Highly recommend against texting. If you do text, put a screenshot of it in the medical record, again, to document what conversation took place between you and the patient, or you and the patient's family. And lastly, take care of yourself. So don't hesitate to reach out to resources, colleagues, mentors. When my husband was in residency and he had been doing I think it was his internship year, he had an ICU rotation, and one of his patients died. And the family sued, and he was named in the suit because obviously when a lawsuit is filed, they name all of the providers. And that was really traumatic. I mean, especially that early in your career, and he wasn't at fault, and was eventually dismissed from the case, but that was really hard for him, and he had to sit through depositions and work with lawyers, and it was before he married me. It was a long time ago. So that was very difficult. So don't underestimate the impact it'll have on you, and make sure you take care of yourself as well. So, any questions? Go ahead. So I think discussing with your colleagues, the more general you can be, the better, as opposed to being very specific about what the adverse event was and the circumstances surrounding the adverse event that would allow for identification of the patient or the specific circumstances. There can be a peer-to-peer evaluation that is protected from discovery, but that's not just you calling up your friend and chatting about it on the phone, or you reaching out to some other colleagues to talk about what transpired and what they might do. Again, if you speak in generalities, that's a little bit different. And, I always recommend that if you are not communicating with counsel, so if you're not communicating with your attorney, verbal communication is likely better, because there's always a risk that your written communication, if you're, for example, emailing back and forth with a colleague or someone else about an adverse event, that would be discoverable in a malpractice claim. All right, thank you.
All right, thanks, Ms. Mallon. I'm going to also thank Dr. Goller for her talk. These topics, I think, just highlight the forms of communication that you as medical students and residents and attendings, I mean, this really holds true to my work every single day. And I wish I had these talks when I was this young. I mean, I'm assuming most of you, of the audience members are residents or medical students, but I wish I had these talks. Electronic and in-person communication is really hard sometimes, and shortcuts end up nipping you in the behind when you try to be quick and cheat your way through a very busy day. And then in-person communication is hard as well. And I if you have any questions for Dr. Goller, I mean, please say hello. I learned a lot in that talk. So thank you. So I'm going to continue for Dr. Dillon, introduce the next two speakers. Alan, great. Why don't you come up?
Our next two speakers are Dr. Jennifer Hargrave and Dr. David Ninan. Following completion of her adult cardiothoracic anesthesiology fellowship, Dr. Hargrave was appointed as staff at the Cleveland Clinic Department of Cardiothoracic Anesthesia and is an associate professor at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine. She's the current Department of Cardiothoracic Anesthesiology Vice Chair of Education and the Cardiothoracic Anesthesiology Fellowship Program Director. Dr. Hargrave is also currently the president of the AOCA. Today, she will be speaking to the students of the group on interviewing for Residency 101. We will also hear from Dr. David Ninan. He currently serves as the Dean and Chief Academic Officer for the Kansas College of Osteopathic Medicine. Before working in undergraduate medical education, he spent a number of years supporting anesthesia residency training programs, where he currently still serves on the ACGME Review Committee for Anesthesiology. He has served in all degrees of medical leadership, including department chair, medical director of perioperative services, and is the president of a medical staff. Dr. Ninen is also the immediate past president of the AOCA. He will be speaking to you on keys to success in your first job. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Jennifer Hargrave and David Ninen.
Okay, all right. So, residents, anyone in the residence home? Okay. All right, so Alan is going to get a wonderful one-on-one mentoring session with David, and but really, our thanks to David. David has been a program director for years before he took on his role as dean, and really has some great insight to share with everyone. And we have a room full of medical students, which is wonderful. Now, one of the things when you are a program director and maybe even the president of the AOCA, you can leverage a little bit and you can ask your friends to come and help. So I have asked a very good friend of mine today, Rachel Deal, if she would come up and sort of help us through this session. Dr. Deal has served on selection committees not only at Cleveland Clinic, but also she is currently on works on both fellowship and residency selection committees at Henry Ford in Detroit. So I thought that she would give a great perspective. She's been on both sides, being that she was recently in training and also is working as a junior faculty. So she can give you some great insights with respect to that. So let me ask, how many first-year med students do we have today? Oh, excellent. Oh, you're preparing early. Okay, very good. Second years? Okay, starting to think about anesthesia a little bit more. Okay, very good. What about third years? Okay, a few third years. What about fourth years? Okay, all right. So interview season is coming up and is going to be very shortly upon you. As I said, we're going to keep this a little bit informal, and I think open to questions. Rachel, if you want to come up here also, maybe have you on the mic. I know Rachel's like, she's really pulling that friend card right now. But yeah, but if Rachel wants to come up here. We also have Helen, Dr. Bean here, who has been a program director, and I think I see Dr. Simon in the back, who's also a program director. So again, please, we're gonna ask questions. We're gonna try to keep this sort of an informal workshop type of format, and I may ask questions of you, but we have a few things that I think we can discuss and really help to prepare you to have the edge up when you come for interviews. So. All right, let me see here. Okay, one thing I want to tell you about interviewing is that there is not a perfect formula. What works for me may not work for you. The most important thing is to figure out what is the best approach strategy for you. And honestly, this probably comes back to being genuine. Rachel, what do you think about that? I mean, yeah, you want to. And individuals, you recognize immediately if you have someone who really truly isn't genuine. They're just trying to give you the canned answers. You can tell it's not really their passion. The way they're answering, it's not them. They're trying to read something off a script. And preparation is important. We're going to talk about that. But be yourself. Be yourself and really figure out the formula that works for you. It is important to understand the value system. And I think that this is helpful for medical students to know, because I had no idea when I went into interviewing. And I don't know, Rachel, if you really knew what program directors were looking for or thinking about, or even the weight on the shoulders of a program director. Because program directors have to answer to their graduate medical education office. They have to answer to their dean, their chairman, depending on how your system is set up. I mean, everyone is, they're making sure that your program is successful. And if your program is not successful, then as a program director, that reflects on you and your leadership. So questions that are commonly asked when metrics are being evaluated on the other side is, hey, how did you feel this year? Did you fill? What rank did you fill with? What's the ratio of, and this is true, and as unfortunate as it may be, was it how many MDs, how many DOs versus international medical grads? I mean, these are all questions that you're asking. Am I right, Helen? Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly. How many of your graduates completed their program? Did they pass their boards? And this is traced out for like a 5-year period of time. What was your success rate? First time success rate on boards, 5-year success rate, how many of your graduates are board certified within X number of years? All of these things, you have to answer to this. ACGME will ask you, your dean will ask you, your chairman will ask you. It's very important that you understand this. What was the scholarly activity like in your program? What did your residents do? Did they present nationally? Did they have papers published? All of those things. DEI metrics, those are important also. They'll ask about those. Did you have did you have a group that you interacted with? And then you're going to be held accountable to your faculty for more of these things. What I call the departmental contributions of your residency class. Did your residents work well? Did they have great work ethics? Were they, dependable providers of anesthesia? Were they professional? Did faculty have to deal with issues of perhaps questionable professional? Residents weren't there on time. They didn't speak in a professional means or method to their trainees. Did they have emotional intelligence? Were they empathetic? Were they mature? Were they resilient? Did they have well-being? All of these things. This is how well do you work with individuals? And I'll tell you, the interview this is what you're really looking for. You're trying to understand if this individual is going to be a good fit for your group. So just a little bit of something to talk about. Helen, how many applications did you have to your program last year?
We had 1,613.
1,613 applications. And how many spots?
9.
9 spots. Okay. No, I'm not here to break your hearts. I'm going to tell you how to work this, how to be successful. Try to make it reasonable. But I can tell you, when you look at this stack of applications, I'm sure Dr. Simon can tell you the same thing back there. It's very overwhelming, right? Because what do you really have to go off when I don't know. You said you had how many interview spots did you offer?
So the students who rotated at our program were able to rotate to rank.
Okay.
Position,
Okay.
unless they bombed the rotation.
Okay. All right. So you kind of had that was your gateway in. Okay.
And additional days, 11 interview days. These were all virtual. Remember that.
Yeah.
It'll still be 100% virtual this year, is my understanding.
Correct.
77 spots.
Okay. So 77 interview spots out of that 1,000+ applications. Okay. So Virginia Mason puts great emphasis on your audition rotation, and that's sort of a gateway into being successful there. But otherwise, this is really all that you have to make that decision of who are you going to give your 77 spots to. There's not a lot. There's board data. Okay, that's now pass-fail. That's really hard to really distinguish anyone based on that. There's your dean's letter, which is different for every medical school that you present at. I mean, I would have to, it was nice when I had individuals interviewing or even applying from the same medical school, because at least you had some commonality in the dean's letter. But otherwise, the dean's letters are very different depending on which medical school you go to. You had a personal statement. Somewhat helpful, not that helpful. You don't know if it was written by the person or not. I'll be honest. You really don't know. You hope so. But now that there's professional personal statement writers, hard to know if it really reflects well on that individual. There's letters of recommendation. And actually, I weight those. Those are one of the few things that you can somewhat get an idea of who the individual is from those. If you have good letters, or letters written by individuals who know how to write a letter of recommendation for an individual. But those are incredibly important, at least when I'm scanning through an application. I don't know, Rachel, Helen, David, any thoughts on letter recommendations?
Yeah, I think that letters that show that you're hardworking and that you really are passionate about anesthesia are what really makes a difference to us. I'm sorry. Especially if multiple people are applying from the same program, I think we do take a look. And then I know that at our program, if there's somebody that we know I hate to say it, but those letters really mean extra. So if there's a program you're extra interested in, I think it's nice to get a letter from a faculty that worked there in the past, because you know you can really trust that letter.
I'll add to that. So during the pandemic, some students asked, do I need a letter of recommendation from an anesthesiologist because I can't get in because things were shut down? I mean, at that time, that was a weird time. So the recommendation was, no, we're not requiring it. Now, you know, we're looking at least one letter of recommendation from the anesthesiologist. It doesn't have to be from Cleveland Clinic. It could be from a private group. But the fact that you sought out a rotation, worked hard enough, built rapport, communicated, you weren't on Instagram the whole time, right, during your rotation. You're actually engaged, you're showing interest, you're not a brown noser, you're not like super annoying, but you're actually engaged and professional. They write you a letter. That's what they want to see when they screen a gazillion applications. And also, out of all the letters I've read, not a single one has said, this is a terrible medical student, do not interview this person, not a single one. But the detail, you know, if someone knows you really well, it comes through. If someone does not know you very well, it shows. Those letters are deemed as, this is a very weak letter, and so whoever you choose to write you a letter of recommendation, choose wisely. Don't just do a letter just because. If you have a really good rapport with a family medicine doc, a dean of a school that you're not even affiliated with, a pathologist, it really doesn't matter. At least get one anesthesiologist. If you have a very good rapport with another specialty in medicine, they can comment on the basics, right? Communication, diligence, your story. That's what we're looking for, is your story. Why are you in medicine? Period. People are forgetting to talk about that.
And I think those are just some really important key points. And I've often wanted to create a workshop on how to write a letter of recommendation, because I see a lot of good letters and a lot of bad letters, and it's not even intentionally bad, but they just don't tell you anything about the person. They have like 3 lines, like, I'd hire this person, they're great, they were friendly to the patients, and they stayed late. They'll be a great resident for you. Okay, and I think that person had the best intention, and unfortunately I feel badly sometimes because medical students don't know what's in those letters. They don't know who's really talented at writing good letters or not. So look for someone who has maybe perhaps some experience, or you would at least assume that they have some experience in writing letters. Again, it doesn't have to always be an anesthesiologist, but do your very best to at least have a mix of some individuals who have some academic experience and sort of know what the expectations are in letters. So audition rotations can be extremely important in that, you know, as again, you're a program director, you're looking at the stack of applications. Who are you going to interview? Did you know that person? It's very helpful, but I know it's very difficult to obtain. Signaling is the new thing in the game, and it's become a game, I think I would say, for sure. We don't have signaling right now for fellowship, but we do have signaling for our core residency program. And I think there's 15 signals this year, if that's correct, 5 gold, 10 silver. And I think when you look at a stack of 1,000 applications, signaling is definitely going to be important. Dr. Bean was talking last night, you know, she often gets asked the question, if I've done a rotation with you, do I need to signal you? Because I only have 15 signals. I mean, if you already know me, do I need to signal? I think it depends on the program. I don't think there's a cut and dry answer to that. Some programs, if you do not signal, they will not interview you, and they have made that clear. So, go ahead. Oh, very good. Okay, for those who are CA1s, they may not have heard this, or first years, they may not have heard this. Because of the overwhelming amount of applications, most individuals apply to 78 programs, 75 to 78 programs. It's overwhelming for the institution to be able to offer interviews and even go through all of those applications. So you can send out your application to an unlimited number or however many locations you want to spend the money for. And then you have the option of trying to tell the program I'm really interested in coming here. So, hey, you're my top 5, you're my gold programs that I'm the most interested in, or you think you're the best chance at getting into those programs. And then you can tell them, hey, you're my second tier, but I'm still really interested in your program, and there's 10 programs that you can identify that for. And that's all within the application system. So, all right. And then the last thing that team selection committees, program directors can really emphasize is the interview and getting to try to know that individual. So I will tell you, interviews can make and break an application, but I will tell you that you can do well at an interview. And so we're going to spend the next little bit of time talking about some of the things behind really being successful at an interview. We'll get some feedback from those in the room who interview individuals and try to understand. So I think the first thing I would say is practice, practice, practice. And I know this may sound surprising, but I think if you walk into an interview without putting some time and preparation into it, you may be one of those individuals who can just, I don't know, you're charismatic, you can just have a conversation with anyone, you know yourself well, you can kind of wing it. But I would say most people are not like that in an interview. So spend time practicing. Practice with friends. I will really say and encourage you, especially in virtual interviewing, you want to record yourself. Record yourself. Practice. Look at it. Watch yourself. I know it's a painful thing, but if you've ever been in a coaching scenario or how to be a better presenter, the first thing they're going to do is make you record yourself, make you watch it. Watch it with a group of people. So it's not, again, it's a very uncomfortable component, but it is something that makes you much better. And so do that and continue practicing. I say expect the expected questions, okay? People are going to ask you, why do you want to be an anesthesiologist? Tell me a little bit about yourself. The why, what, when components of an interview. Have answers to those in the back of your mind that you've probably practiced. But expect the unexpected, because a really good interviewer is going to walk you through both of those scenarios. They're going to have the expected questions, and then they're going to see how you think on your feet, and there will be an unexpected question. Most commonly will be give examples and tell me about things. And that's really actually, if you read any of the HR literature about how to understand a person, how to understand how they think, it's always about give examples, tell me how you did something, and those have certainly been integrated into residency interviews. Anything you'd add about that, Rachel or Helen?
I think that's pretty comprehensive. I think we just briefly spoke about the great importance in recording yourself. At least what I've seen in interviews is that when people don't record themselves, they might not realize that there's bad lighting. They might not realize that there's background noise. And when you don't get to meet someone in person, this is your first impression. So all of those things, unfortunately, kind of add up to be part of your first impression. And it shows if you've really prepared and looked at a recording of yourself.
I can tell you right now, the recording of this is not going to be good. Okay? There's a big light behind me. It's going to be hard to see me on the screen. If you didn't have this open, though, it would be very dark and it would be very hard to see me. So think about that. Think about that when you're setting up your area in which you're interviewing and such things. Helen, anything else to add?
Absolutely. Practice. I mean, not to say that you should look at yourself and just comment on every do I have a pimple? Like, that sort of thing. But you want to make sure your lighting isn't lighting, you're not too close to the computer. I'm totally gutting this, by the way, but I want you all, especially MS4s, to be successful. Gosh, it's just like October, right? So it's coming up. Lighting, how close you are to the camera. If you have a gaming chair, I recommend you guys know what a gaming chair is. Do not sit in a gaming chair. Because what happens is you get really slouchy and too comfortable. Posture is huge. So if you're like this, I tend to look away when I speak. Just put a little sticker where it looks like you're looking at the person. What happens with people who don't do well in person, having an eye-to-eye contact will reflect to the 100 times on camera. You look around, you just, that's what you do when you're on Zoom lectures and Zoom calls. You're distracted. And Don't ramble too much with your answers. Be very clear in the beginning of your interview if you're going to take notes. Otherwise, it looks like you're texting your friend or on Instagram or doing something else, Twitter, whatever you guys do these days.
TikTok, they're on TikTok.
Just make sure you're very clear. Like, is it okay if I take notes, Dr. So-and-so? What else? The behavioral questions are big.
They are very big. And I think one thing that I'll say is it's important to be yourself. It's not about, you're not going to survive an interview if you're trying to be something that you're not. At least in a good interview, with a skilled interviewer. But be yourself, be prepared, and you'll be a better presentation of yourself. Comment a little bit about the format of an interview. So this is going to be 99% of your interviews are going to be something like this. They're going to ask you, tell me about yourself. They're going to ask you, why do you want to be an anesthesiologist? They're going to maybe figure out if you understand some of the challenges or some of the components of the specialty. You know, what does it mean to be an anesthesiologist? What are some of the challenges to be an anesthesiologist, etc. Then they're going to spend probably the rest of the time deciding on your character and asking questions about your character. You know, tell me about leadership. Tell me about a time where, you know, you did something, or, you know, what do you like outside of medicine? That's a very common question. But this is where they're going. They're trying to make sure that you're going to fit well in their organization, their department, their residency, etc. And then the interview will probably end with asking you if you have any questions for them. Anything else you would add to that? That's kind of the breakdown. Helen, anything else?
Yeah, I'm around all day, so if you guys have any specific questions, I'm happy to do a mock, do something, you know, very directed. You know, what do you think about this? I put this on the application, that sort of thing. As she highlighted, there's no formula. It's really hard nowadays without the numbers to screen applications. ERAS on our end has filters, you know, like Signal is an easy filter. Those who don't have to Signal, some programs like the big ones may just say, oh, if you don't Signal, you're not going to get an interview. We just don't have the bandwidth to do that. Just be yourself, practice your interviews, and then, you know, I think the MS1s and 2s, even 3s that are here you guys are amazing for being here. I think that's where it all starts. And practicing, knowing the specialty, and networking. I can't tell you how small this world is. Dr. Hargrave was an attending for my old resident who did a fellowship there, and she's now one of my partners. But like I said, it's
very small.
Tiffany by saying, hey, I met Dr. Hargrave. Why?
It is very small, and people ask. That's one of the first things that they, you know, if anyone is going out for a position, one of my fellows are graduating, wherever they go, before they even contact that fellow and say, hey, we're interested in interviewing you, there are emails or phone calls or texts that are sent back to Cleveland Clinic to ask, hey, is Rachel, was she a good fellow resident for you? She's someone we should be looking at? They haven't even responded to Rachel's application. So just realize it's a very small world. You can go online, and I would recommend that you do, and it will talk about some of the top questions that you may have on an anesthesiology interview. A few things and just sort of themes that I think are reasonable to know. The questioning may be a little bit about your knowledge of that residency program and why you were interested in that residency program. Very common kind of thoughts of questions they may ask. A little bit about anesthesiology, the procedures, the best practices. I never want to ask a trainee a lot of clinical practice questions. You may have a very basic one, maybe something about tell me about a challenging case that meant a lot to you, you learned something from. But it's not fair to ask a medical student how to manage a difficult airway, how would you put an epidural in this patient. Those are not really, that's why you're going to spend 4 years training with me. That's not really something that I expect you to know. So don't feel like you need to be an anesthesiologist to come and interview for an anesthesiology residency. Certainly your background, your personal experiences, your goals, and ambitions? What are your thoughts after residency? And then starting to talk about interpersonal and patient skills. Tell me a meaningful time with a patient that you've had as a medical student. Tell me a time in which you demonstrated leadership. Tell me a time in which you were an effective team player. Something to that extent. So think about those. Again, going back, be genuine, know yourself, know who you are, and I would encourage you to spend some time preparing. That includes mindfulness. We're going to have a lecture on mindfulness here at this conference, so think about it. Just sitting and thinking, okay, who am I? What is important to me? What do I find meaningful? What are some of the events that in my life that have led to the things that I am involved with now, or the skill set that I have especially? Think how to answer difficult questions, and as Dr. Bean mentioned, be concise, but provide information. So if the individual asks you a question, the interviewer asks you a question, answer it, give some details with it, but then you don't want to just continue to feed into it, because there's more questions to go. It can be very difficult as an interviewer if you have sort of your 5 or 6 questions that you want to ask. You ask the first question, and it's like a 7-minute answer, and you're trying to kind of get to other portions, to other things that you want to decide on. So kind of gauge how much feedback you're getting from that individual who's interviewing you, if it's time to kind of wrap up your question or not. It's okay not to have an answer, but explain your thoughts. And what I mean by this is saying, what would you like to do 5 years from now? You're going to finish up your residency program. Maybe you don't know, and that's okay. You can say, I don't really know. I have some interest in perhaps whether it be location, or I had some interactions with this group at X location, and I really liked the way they had their practice set up. So I'm looking for something like that. That's fine. Or I really love teaching others, and I think that maybe I do want to go into an academic. That's fine. You may not have the perfect answer, and I really don't expect a medical student to have that answer, but it does at least show that you've thought towards what your value system is and where you may want to go in the future. When asked what you should ask, because everyone there are going to ask you, what questions do you have for me? That's coming at you. I would say ask something that don't just ask the common sort of cliche questions. For example, what are the strengths of your program? What are the weaknesses of your program? What have you changed in the last few years? Those are very common sort of cliche questions. You do get important information from those questions, but everyone asks those questions. So maybe say something like this. I spoke to your resident. They talked to me about the simulation program that you've just had. Could you give me some more information on that and what your plan is long-term for that? Show some interest in the program, some specifics. Try to ask details if you can. And ask something very genuine. Something, you are interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you, but ask something that's going to help you make a decision. And it may be as simple as, tell me a little bit about the hospital environment. It may be something about, can you tell me a little bit about the neighborhoods around the hospital? Where do people live? Something that's helping you make a decision. So be sure to consider that. I will say that time with residents matters. So you're going to talk to a resident and a trainee there, and if you don't talk to a trainee at a program, I guess Helen, I'll ask you: Did you have trainees involved in the selection process?
In the selection process,
or at least interviewing?
Sure,
yeah.
With evaluations from the rotations.
Okay.
Saying, hey, you gotta rank this guy.
Okay. So not in the interviews. Okay. Rachel, do you have?
Yeah, so both in Cleveland and now at Henry Ford, we actually have resident interviewers, and they're typically chief residents, so they kind of have a leadership role within the program. Dr. Hargrave and I kind of spoke about this. We put a lot of weight on what the residents think, both residents that might have worked with you on an audition rotation and then residents that interview you, because they're looking for their peers. They're really invested in this, and they want colleagues that are hardworking. They want colleagues that will mesh with the group. So what they say means a lot, and I think every once in a while we get somebody who takes things too casually with their resident interviewer. So I think that's kind of what Dr. Hargrave is touching on here.
Yeah, and residents will be honest with you. They will tell you positives and negatives. They want They want the individuals that they're talking to know what they didn't know before they came to the program. When they were in your shoes, what did they wish they would have known? So they will be very honest with you, and you can ask very honest questions with them. I will tell you, though, that they will give feedback on unprofessional concerning behavior. I mean, if you go into super casual mode, you start using profanity, you start asking questions that indicate maybe that you're not going to be a team player, you're not going to work as hard for the group, they will provide that feedback to, I mean, they want individuals who are going to work with the group and be a great team player. So they will tell the team, hey, I spoke to this medical student. First thing they asked me is, how early do we get out? They asked, do we have time to moonlight? They asked, how hard do we have to work? Those are going to be red flags, and that will most likely come back to the program. So consider that. I mean, use them, learn from them, still be professional with it. A little bit about virtual interviews, because everyone will now be doing virtual. And so it is important. I mean, Dr. Bean and Dr. Deal gave both some insight in that. We talked about the light behind us. Things will happen with technology, and don't panic when they happen. Okay, your computer froze, is all hope gone? No. There are things, though, that are problematic, especially if it's a lack of being prepared. So, for example, if the problem is that you didn't log into the system, become familiar with the system, and you're running around and you're late because you can't get the system, that reflects poorly on you. But if you're prepared, you show that you're prepared. I know I mentioned here, and this is actually a big faux pas, missing an interview because of a time zone issue. I mean, that begins to show professionalism. How interested are you in the program? Did you make sure your I's dotted, your T's crossed? Things like that. No distractions. I actually recommend you turn off your phones. Turn off your email. It can be very distracting if you have your email pulled up on your screen, you have your interview platform, and you're hearing the ding of Outlook, knowing someone's getting in. Make sure that's off. Note taking and using notes to take questions, that's perfectly fine. It is nice to, and it is appropriate to ask, may I look at my notes? Is it okay if I take some notes while we're talking here? That's perfectly fine, but just be professional and ask. That way there isn't ambiguity. The individual knows what you're doing. Do not have notes on your computer screen. It just doesn't, I don't know, it's up to, but it doesn't look good when you're sitting here going like this, scrolling up and down on the same screen where you're trying to talk. Number one, it's going to be stressful for you. Number two, it's a very odd look for someone who's interviewing you. Check your sound and lighting, record yourself. Simple, professional, and I'll say dress for the job you want. It is, there still is even though it's a new platform, it's virtual, it's traditional. So make sure that it's simple, but it is professional. You don't want individuals distracted by things. And, I was talking to Dr. Deal. I said, this is not the jacket to wear for a medical school, for a residency interview. Okay, it's a little bit different. We're in Florida. It's a conference here, and so just slightly different. And but this is a different thing. This is not what I would wear to a job interview. It's not what you should wear to a job interview. But just keep that in mind, that there's simple, traditional is the best to go. Make sure the tie's straight. Make sure that the jewelry's on the way you want it to be, and all of those things. So you just have a very professional appearance. So, anything else that anyone wants to add to that? I don't have a lot to say on that, I'll be honest, because I'm on the selection committees, but I don't really necessarily look at, I just say I think this individual's a good match. I don't know if Helen or David or someone who's had a little bit more program director would say anything.
UPMC's graduate medical education goal is to retain 50% of all their graduates. So just understand that is something that they're having in the back of their mind. They don't pressure us to solely recruit residents that are going to stay in our geographic area. UPMC has a broad area, it's the entire state of Pennsylvania, but I think can be a factor. I think you speak more in generalities as far as the question of where you see yourself in 5 years. The more flexible that you can give a response, I think the better. To specifically say, I want to come back to St. Petersburg, Florida. That perceived as a negative by some programs.
Anything else? Okay. Any other questions we have so far? One in the back. I think that's a great question. So the question was regarding now that step one is pass fail, and it's interesting. In some ways, it makes it more difficult for programs to filter. I'll be honest. I know programs that filtered at a certain board score. So historically, when step one had a number, they would put that number in their ERAS filter. Anyone who didn't have that number, it went off. But I think pass-fail makes it more difficult for the program directors to be able to sort of say this individual, when they're weighting individuals, when you've got those, 5 things that you can sort of look at, it's how do you weight that? No one knows. So I think if they're going to shift away, I mean, if it's a fail, it's problematic. If it's a pass, that's great. Now let's go to the next thing on this list where I can try to differentiate candidates. So I don't know if there's any other feedback on.
Just there's no, you can't make up and redo it, right? If you got a C on a test and you redid it and you got an A, that actually would help, right? But if you fail, don't fail.
Don't fail. I think it's very reasonable to say that. It's very difficult to overcome that. So, yeah. And so make sure that the letters of those other things that I mentioned that are important, make sure that those are there. Okay. All right. So Dr. Deal and I are going to do a little bit of mock interviews here and go through a couple of questions, and then we'll get some feedback from the audience as to how the response was to that and things that could have been done better. And yeah, and then maybe we'll do like one that's maybe not so good and then try to ask the question again and try to come up with better answers just so you have a chance to see some things. We'll get some feedback and try to incorporate that. So, okay, does that sound helpful for individuals? Okay, all right.
Unless a medical student wants to be interviewed, I don't want to take
Well,
that
we
away.
won't. We'll do one.
We'll
do one, and then if anyone wants to, it's free practice. Okay. All right, so we'll just go through a question or few, one or so, and go from there. Well, here we go.
All right. Well, it's nice to meet you, Jennifer. I hope you've had a nice day so far with the other interviewers. Do you have any questions for me?
This is easy because I sort of said how I would ask this question, but let's start with this. So I saw last year that you increased your number of residency positions by 2. And I wondered if you could tell me just a little bit behind why that was a great decision for you to make and how that's impacted the residents.
That's a great question, Jennifer. It shows you know about the program. So we got feedback from our residents that they felt there was enough case volume. We worked with the GME committee closely, and we felt that we had enough educational resources, we had enough case volume, and we felt that actually the residents would benefit by increasing the program by 2 slots, especially because it would allow them more flexibility in their elective rotations.
So do you see how that question gave me a lot of information regarding the training program, or how my question to the program director or the faculty who's interviewing me gave a lot of information? So let me now try to answer that question in a bit of a little bit more of a casual way and see the difference. Could you just tell me what you think the strengths are of your program?
So there's many strengths to our program. We feel that we have a robust educational program. We have fellowships in all of the ACGME accredited divisions. We have residents that have passed the boards at 100% pass rate over the last 5 years. And our residents are very satisfied with the program.
And that's probably about the 10th time of the day that you've been asked that question. I can tell you by about the 7th time that question you've been asked as an interviewer, you're sort of tired of, you're like, give me a little something more to work with there. So
right. The student learns nothing that they couldn't have basically found on the internet. All of that is already basically available, I would say.
Yeah. So
maybe not the board pass rates, but I think that you can typically find those.
You want me to ask a question of you, or?
Sure.
Okay. Rachel, tell me a little bit about a challenge in life that you have experienced and how you overcame that challenge.
This is a hard one. Let me think about it. Well, I got a car for my 16th birthday. And I was really excited at first because it was the exact car that I wanted. But I found out that it was actually a stick shift. And I had never worked on driving one of those before. So it was really overwhelming to figure that out. But it was a challenge for me, and I was able to, work through that, and I actually got really good at driving that car, and I was able to drive it really fast.
Now you laugh, but that was an exact answer that I had to a question. And it took at least 3 minutes of silence to be able to come up with that example. Dr. Deal was polite. She only gave about 30 seconds. But I can tell you, though, so that could have been presented in a positive way, but it really just didn't. It didn't show a challenge that many people would find as a true challenge. For example, it's a little bit of, and I forgot the car, I think it was a Porsche. She was telling me about the Porsche, and it didn't go over well. So think about that. This is why mindfulness is important. This is why taking some time to prepare. Rachel, so the same question. Could you tell me about a challenge that you've had and how you've overcome that challenge?
Sure. So when I was a chief resident and working on the scheduling, we had a resident that actually got sick and had to be removed from the schedule on short notice. So I had to work with my co-chief and also really rally the other residents to be able to fill those shifts. It wasn't easy at first because nobody wants additional call shifts, but we were able to come up with a plan with the program director to incentivize that and make sure that everybody felt that they were both helping their colleagues and their needs were being met.
Okay, much better response. So just a few things to think about. Are there any questions from the audience that I can, there's one here.
Is it appropriate to take that pause and think about responses?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
What would you say is too long?
I think 10 seconds is really good if you can practice that, but practice it and see what your natural response is. And I think it's good to have a bit of a pause before a question, especially if they're thoughtful questions. And some questions, some questions are secondary. I can tell you a common line of questioning that I like to ask, at least of fellowship candidates, would be, what do you think are the characteristics of an excellent cardiac anesthesiologist or even anesthesiologist? I'll ask that question. And then the secondary follow-up question is, tell me, or can you give me an example in when you excelled or even failed at that characteristic, depending on what I feel like asking that day. And, but those are kind of secondary questions that you may see. And so just be prepared for that. It's a little bit more conversational when you go through the interview versus kind of having a list of things that you're going through. You're building on some of the feedback they give you. Anything else? Yes.
How much do you think we should draw on our experiences, like as a medical student, and in that journey, say, for a challenging experience versus other things that are outside of the medical school experience, or it doesn't matter?
You can ask the interviewer.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
This application, as you guys know, it's only going to be 10 experiences, right? So for MS1s, last year and years before, you can have, I think it was unlimited, but list your research, work, and volunteer as 3 major sections. Trust me, don't just put it on there just to look good. I had a dog walker for a volunteer experience. It was like 1 hour, and that really dinged that applicant. So, this year, they're limited to 10 experiences. You pick and choose. If your question is, what you're asking is, if my answer reflects an experience, is that okay? Absolutely. Don't think too much about that. Because if you think too much about that, it will come through. We know. We know.
Yeah, and I would think you can give a challenge. I think the learning to drive a stick shift maybe is a little weak. It doesn't show a lot of
depth to your character, you'd have to work hard on developing that to really show a depth in character. It would be one thing to say that I went on a medical mission, and part of the medical mission was that I needed to drive a car with medical supplies in a third world country, and they only had stick shift, and I didn't know. That's different.
That's a great answer, actually.
That's a great answer, right? But it has to be true. But exactly, it has to be true. But it lets you see how you could use that same event could be much more powerful when it's set in a context of my dad just bought me a Porsche because I turned 16. That isn't necessarily going to help show your relatability to the majority of people you'll be taking care of. So. Yeah, but I often will challenge individuals to give me examples outside of medicine because I'm trying to learn about the individual and understand how they sort of got to their process, how they went into medical school. So knowing a little bit about them outside of medical school is helpful. So, okay. Well, I believe Dr. Clower is one of our keynote speakers. He's going to be speaking at 10:30 downstairs. It would be a good opportunity to check out the information he's going to bring. I'm around. Dr. Deal will be around some too. Dr. Bean is here. Dr. Simon's here. If you have questions, please ask us. We're here to support you and to see that you're successful in interviewing. And again, as I said, I cannot emphasize enough practice. Take this seriously because it's. I know in our generation, or I should say this better, I come from a different generation than you are. Sometimes there's a bit of casualness that's considered cool in younger generations. It's always historically been that way. The interview process, though, there's still a formality. There's a professionalism component to it. So do keep that in mind as you are considering and preparing. Thank you very much.